Oh my goodness. I just realized that I have been on mute the entire time I have been talking. I'm going to restart this little live stream introduction. I apologize for that. So let's try this one more time. How hard is it for your service member to share their feelings? I've had a lot of practice over the years with very little success to get my spouse to be more vocal about his emotions. So tell me, why do service members in particular find it difficult to unpack emotions and share them with people that are supposed to be safe, like us? Do they feel like nobody's going to understand them? Is it fear of a negative reaction from others? Or maybe it's because they aren't even sure how to vocalize the emotions that they are having. Now, transition brings out a lot of very strong feelings, transition and retirement for sure. Service members are really good at compartmentalizing, shuffling things into little compartments, and then putting them away. But those things don't disappear. In fact, their inability to express their emotions about what is happening can make this process even of transition or retirement even more difficult. It causes relationship issues. It stagnates a healthy move into the civilian world. So my guest today is Ann Kramer. Ann is a licensed counselor, a clinical social worker. She's a trauma therapist, and she works with veterans specifically. Ann's going to dig into the perception about how our military culture really doesn't accept and even discourages service members from displaying emotional responses, which I think is really kind of fascinating because it plays a lot into what's happening during transition and retirement. Now, thank you for joining me. Let me introduce myself. My name is Anna Larson. I am your Transition and Retirement SpaceLink Ambassador. I'm also a copywriter, digital marketer. I'm a homeschool mom, and I'm a retired military spouse or a veteran military spouse, or I am the military spouse of a veteran, however you want to put it. These live streams are for military spouses that are looking for connection and support as they near or cross over into transition or retirement from the active duty world. Now, SpouseLink was created in 2012 by AFMA, the American Armed Forces Mutual Aid Association, to support, inform, and inspire military spouses around the world. As we dive into today's topic, please leave comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Interact with our guest. Ask questions that you have. We love for these to be very interactive. So feel free to drop information in there. I can share it on the screen. And it's important for us to know what you're thinking and feeling and what's important to you. So without further conversation, I am going to pull up our slides again so that I can share with you who my guest is going to be today. So Ruth Ann Kramer, she goes by Ann. She is a clinical social worker, trauma therapist. She's also a mom, a friend, a daughter, a military spouse, a veteran, and an advocate. So Ann received her master's of social work with a medical specialization from Catholic University of America of Washington, D.C. in 2014. That was following 8 years of her service as a Signal Corps officer in the United States Army. As a licensed clinical social worker, Ann has a demonstrated history of working as a psychotherapist in the mental health care industry. She holds additional certifications where she specializes in working with those affected by addiction and trauma, and she utilizes sand tray therapy with that. Ann is currently serving as a therapist in trauma recovery services with the Department of Veteran Affairs. So she is ground zero, boots on the ground with our transitioning and retiring service members. Ann is a volunteer with the American Red Cross as a reconnection workshop facilitator. So military life, soldier, and as a military spouse has brought her to live in Georgia, Korea, North Carolina, Iraq, Maryland, Texas, Hawaii, and Virginia, which is where she currently resides. Boy, don't we just love that big laundry list of locations? Like, cannot every military spouse totally identify with that? Okay, so with that, I'm going to pull this back down. I am going to bring up Ann. Hi, Ann.
Hey, Anna.
I'm so glad to have you here. First of all, I'm so sorry that I started this whole live stream on mute, which is crazy, right? We have some people here watching with us live, so I just want to welcome you all. We're very excited to have you here. And look, you've even got a fan. You've got a fan in the crowd right now. So Thank you, Sarah. She is amazing, which is one of the reasons why I wanted Anne to be a guest on the live stream, because when I just had this brief conversation with her, I'm talking about you in the third person, but when I had a brief conversation with you, Anne, what I realized is you are really like down. You are the person that these veterans are coming to when they hit the kind of a rock bottom, even, or maybe not even rock bottom, but when they're on that path, right? How has that been for you, like working in that arena?
I know they're coming because they've hit that rock bottom, but it's also comforting and knowing that they're putting trust in the Veterans Affairs and other organizations that are out there. And they have hope that there is a better life after what they're experiencing.
Yeah, I think that sums up exactly too why we even wanted to have a live stream on this topic, right? Because there's a lot of military families out there that are really struggling through the transit, and really a lot of times I feel like this comes up after the transition has happened. There's so much going on that you don't even have time or the bandwidth to think about it in the forefront or during transition. But as soon as you're transitioned, then it's like, now what, right? Like, what do we do? So, okay, now we're starting the conversation without actually throwing questions at you. So let me throw up our first question, because I think we can start kind of at the beginning and walk through. And again, to anybody listening live, please feel free to drop in comments or questions for Anne as we go. All right, so our first question for you, Anne, is what are the most common emotions you see from service members that are either in transition or coming to you for therapy post-service?
Yeah, so when it comes to emotions, the biggest theme to be aware of is a disconnection that military members experience during their transition. They have a disconnection from their family life, their military community, and an overall sense of purpose that is no longer there. They're leaving this life where they were connected to their fellow service members, but now being surrounded to family life in a way that they've never experienced. Because of service, we know they're out in the field, they have sea duty, a lot of times have rotating work shifts or deployments. And because of these things that they've gone through, they're experiencing many emotions. And a lot of times the emotions, they're experiencing them all at once. They have emotions of anger, resentment, sadness, fear, shame, and guilt. And these emotions are tied to many things that happened while they were serving, and also things that they missed out on with their family because of service.
Oh my gosh. So can I just tell you that when you're talking about this, I'm just sitting over here going, yep. Like I can totally relate to what you're saying. And when you talk about that word disconnection, like for me, that really is like a lack of closeness, right? Like when I feel disconnected, there's this lack of closeness. And I know from experience that when you feel like your service members pulling away, or you see them pulling away from like the kids or their parents, or our friends that we've had for years and years and years, it's really hard because you feel like, oh, they don't want to be here with me. And logically, I know that this is part of what they're dealing with, that physical and emotional intimacy, that loss of being able to connect with one. I know that logically, but in the moment, emotionally, it's like, it's hard. And it's, it's for the spouse, it's hard. And then we get angry back, right? So that disconnect is really a big deal. It's like in my experience with retired friends, it's one of the first things I hear military spouses say to me. I don't know what they want. They can't express to me what they're pulling away. They don't want to go anywhere. They don't want to do anything with us. So that is just like what you just said is just, I can so relate to as far as being a transition spouse goes.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add about the emotion that does come up often is anger, because in the military, it's almost socially acceptable to display anger, whether it's with yelling or physical hand gestures. I hear people call it a hand knife, or they're like the chest stab, like you're pointing at someone's chest. These expressions of anger are okay in a military environment because they're accepted, but they quickly learn that outside of the military, that is not acceptable.
Yeah, that is so true. And anger is an interesting one for me. I've done a lot of just behind the scenes research because of these live streams that I do with SpouseLink. And with anger, there was a Journal of Psychiatric Research study that I had read, and it talked about how 30.7% of veterans, and then I think it was like 15% of active duty service members feel what they call powerful anger. And so this isn't just like, oh, I'm grumpy, or oh, they did something and that made me mad. This is the kind of anger that leads to substance abuse, domestic violence, suicide, right? I mean, this is the kind of anger that leads to that. So for the number in veterans to be at 30% based on this one psychiatric study is just horrifying to me. Like, that is a huge number. And we talk about veteran suicides and all that kind of stuff, but this is one of those reasons why I feel like the emotions, the inability to express those emotions, is one of the reasons why those numbers are so high.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So that was a very deep and a little, that was a heavy conversation, like, to start with. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that this is a heavy conversation, and families that are going through this, every service member is going to be responding differently to that transition. And some of them might have that knife hand. Some of them might do that finger point. What do you do? Right? What are you going to do when that happens? So let's pull up our second question for you. What are some possible reasons why service members have a hard time telling their families what they're experiencing and asking for help?
I believe a big reason our service members, both men and women, feel they can't ask for help is this need to hold up this image that they don't have a problem dealing with their emotions and they've got it all figured out. When we know, looking from the outside, that they probably don't, and that's okay that they don't, because they're going into this new unknown. We also need to consider the messages that are communicated in our society, in our culture, and in our families. There's core beliefs learned at a very young age about what is the right way to express an emotion and whether it's okay to talk about them. With men, when they're young, with boys, you'll hear a lot of messages of, you don't show your emotions. If you do, you're weak. And if you show your emotion, you're a girl. And they're still called those things even as men. And then with women, when we're young girls, we're often given the space to express our emotions because, well, we're girls. And but that's not always what's learned by everyone, but those are themes that I tend to see. But so when our service members then join the military, they're learned these new belief system around emotions, like what emotions are okay to express, what emotions are good or bad. The military tends to have this mindset of just do it. Doesn't matter how you feel, the mission needs to get done, and we don't even need to talk about it afterwards because it's over with. But because of the research that's been done, we know that emotions don't go away if we don't do anything about them. There are times in the military that you don't need to think or feel, you just need to do. But we need to start learning to talk about the things that we have experienced even afterwards, so that they know how to deal with those emotions when they come back up. And so overall, when we learn at any point that it's not okay to talk about how we're feeling, we turn to other ways to deal with those emotions alone. We internalize our feelings. We use avoidance behavior such as numbing, eating disorders, self-harm, substance abuse, and what you brought up earlier, even suicide.
Yeah. And that's that powerful anger we're talking about, right? So basically what you're saying is, here they go through they're conditioned as children, right? Because they're, first of all, let me just acknowledge that there are gender stereotypes out there in the world, as much as we may not want them to be. They are just there. Dorothy, one of our active listeners right now, brought this one, right? Boys don't cry. That's a big one. Or girls do cry. I mean, whatever it might be. Or if a boy cries, he's a girl, which, then, anyway, all of those things, whether we want them there or not, they are there. And it is pervasive in the military culture. To those gender stereotypes are pervasive there. And so when you were talking about that at the very end, right, like they're conditioned to not show emotions there as children, then you go into an environment, basically a company culture is what it is, a culture where now you're either even further conditioned to not only show emotion, but don't even ever talk about it, because once it's done, it's done. What do we have to talk about? Right? Like, I love that you said that, because that really is true. I remember asking my spouse about his first deployment, the first deployment our family had gone through. And he was like, it's over. That we don't need to discuss it. I had no clue. I didn't know until now. I mean, it's been almost 20 years. And now, only now is when I'm finding out what that first deployment was like for him and the things that he went through. And so in my head, I just think, what a difference could it make if there was a mandatory round table of emotion sharing? I mean, I'm just going to throw it out there, and we laugh, because could you imagine that happening in a military environment? I can't, but it makes me laugh to think about it. Anyway, okay, so yes, so these stereotypes are on steroids. That I totally agree with you. And yeah, Jessica, absolutely. I think that this is why we're here having this conversation, right? Because it's so important to be talking about this and understanding where our service member, as a military spouse, right? Where our service member is coming from, the environment that they've lived in, whether it be for 4 years or for 24 years or some 30 years for some people, right? That is a significant part of your life, to be ingrained in a specific culture. Now, that being said, remember how slowly the military works. Like, this is not going to change overnight. So to battle some of this, I want to dig a little bit into what you have seen, Anne, in your work, and what you've seen be an effective method of supporting a service member that is having a hard time expressing emotions and talking about things. So let me throw up our third question for you, which is, why do they become so prevalent at the time of transition? What is it that spurs this?
This is a lot about what I share with veterans when I work with them now, but the reason is because trauma is very common with our service members, and these are things that they're not going to be sharing at home. The high tempo of military life helps our service members to avoid thinking and feeling about these things that they've experienced, and they were never given a space to talk about these things. These are traumas such as military sexual trauma, combat exposure, injuries, the loss of fellow service members, and maybe even things our service members were asked to do that did not align with their values, which is also referred to as moral injury. So when they're in a time of transition, that high tempo life that they're used to starts to slow down and sometimes even stop. And that's when trauma memories come back and creep in. When we're relaxed, sleeping, we're not doing anything, those things will start to come back. So the military life helped them to avoid. This is why they have a difficult time now, because these things are going to come back. They're going into this new phase of life where they're also expected to still be the breadwinner in many cases. And so they need to still keep that image that everything's okay, even though they're no longer wearing the uniform. So there's messages that we know through research that are learned from our veterans, that men have this message that men are strong. If you show emotions, you're soft. And these are things they're learning in the military. And women are learning that if they show their emotions, they're a problem. So service members start to have this internal seesaw battle when they're in service, and the military is telling them, ask for help. But what they see is the ones that ask for help are either shunned or hazed in their units, or they're even separated from service. So there's no positive aspect to asking for help from what they see. And so they carry these messages and these beliefs after service. Even though they're no longer wearing the uniform, those beliefs are still there.
Oh my gosh. I think that you are vocalizing right now what I think like a lot of people feel but don't say out loud. I mean, there's the common perception. So my husband was in military intelligence branch. There was no way he was ever going to go see a therapist during his service, time in service, because he could lose his clearance. He could be deemed a risk. He could lose his entire job. I mean, that was his livelihood, right? I mean, that wasn't even on the cards of things that we were potentially going to be talking about him doing at all. And I know that that is not just my family. Like that is service members across the board. Like that fear of reprisal and or being seen in a certain way. Like I love that you said, girls are a problem if they're crying or complaining. Boys are weak if they're complaining or whining about something. I mean, that is such a negative environment to be living in, and trying to combat that by yourself, knowing that even if people around you may feel the same way, maybe leadership doesn't have your back because they've grown up in the exact same environment. I mean, what do you do? I mean, I know we're going to get kind of to the what do you do portion of it, but really, like when these service members come to you, what do you see when they're talking to you? Like, what are the emotions that they're expressing?
A lot of them, they don't know how to put their emotions into words, which it makes so much sense. And it's mostly men that have a problem doing that. Like when I give them assignments, they say, I couldn't put this emotion into words. It's just a feeling. Or they use thoughts to describe their emotions. So I'm almost retraining them of how to identify, like, what were you feeling? How does that feel now? So it's like retraining, like basic things that we're built to feel and experience, but they weren't allowed to do those things.
It's interesting that you say that. So I want to okay, again, whenever I have a live stream guest, I always like try and do a little bit of research about just the topic and what it was. And I got really intensely involved with reading about this whole idea of conditioning, military conditioning. And what I found is this is not just something that happens in the United States military. It is like across the world, prevalent across the world. And they call it psychological conditioning because they're trying to train soldiers to have an automatic response to something that occurs, which is in theory for us a good thing, right? I mean, that is what we want. Highly trained, skilled soldiers that know what to do in the moment. We don't want them freaking out and running around like crazy. We want them to know what to do. But the downside of this then becomes what we're talking about here. So I found this article I read, and the link's right there, the Mission Victory India. This isn't even an American article. It was a Commodore from India that was writing this article. But what he said, I think, really applies here, that psychological conditioning techniques are extensively used to shape attitudes and behaviors and rendering them to conform to the requirements of the military. And that's kind of what you're talking about, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when we see this, and it's happening not just in our country, but across the world, we are essentially creating a generation of people, or a subculture, I guess, of people that don't know how to express what is happening. And ultimately that, I mean, where do we see this going? Like in the big picture, like I'm throwing this out. This isn't a question that we even talked about, but I'm curious, Anna, what do you see happening if in someone's life, if they are unable to deal with this?
I guess a short answer would be it can cause some multi-generational trauma. Because we then pass these messages on to our family or children. It's just this ongoing cycle that if you don't change, there will be no change.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that is the short answer, right? If you don't change, there is no change. And you teach whoever you're in contact with the same things you've been taught. And so there is that long-term then generational. Oh, that's really interesting. So yeah, so Sarah says exactly, and you've got some people that I was like, yes. And she also threw this up. In turn, the discipline is often brought home in the secondary conditionings of their dependents. So exactly what you just said. Yeah, echoing kind of what you were saying. It is really interesting to me that, I mean, we are dealing with it. We military spouses are dealing with this with just our service member, but understanding that you are not by yourself. This is not just you and your spouse and you're the only two going through this. I think is another really important thing that I want to make sure anyone listening here today or watching the replay understands, right? You are not alone in this area. Like this is something that every military spouse is going to go through. I don't know a single service member that has not been affected in some way by this culture that's been created in the military of conditioning. And again, there's some really positive things for that, but there's also some very detrimental sides of that conditioning that's happened. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, is that an inability to share those emotions, unpack them, be present, not isolate, and be part of a healthy transition out of the military into the civilian world. So yeah, Sarah says no one's talking about these issues. We're trying, Sarah. That's why Anne and I are here today. We're trying. And the stigma is pervasive. Yeah. So I absolutely agree with both of you. Like it's one of the reasons why SpouseLink wants to do these conversations. And let me just put this out as I am not an expert, right? Like I'm just a military spouse. I'm a digital marketer. I deal in social media. I write things. I write articles and blogs and newsletters and all that kind of thing. This is not my specialty, but I'm also a military spouse that's transitioned with a service member. And so I know what that means for me and my family. And so anyway, I'm glad to have this platform and to be able to have you on this platform and to be able to bring this out for more military spouses and service members so that they feel more comfortable having these conversations. Okay, let's jump into our next question for you. So let's talk about the next steps, right? So here we are. This was a perfect lead in because here I am a family member, right? I am one of the spouses. What can I do to help my service member during this transition to deal with this? Because again, let's be realistic. This is not happening 3 years before. Very few families are starting to deal with this 3 years before. Very few families have the time or energy to deal with it during transition. This is something that starts to crop up when your service member is going through their VA disability requirements with their doctors. This is something that crops up when now they're home all the time and or can't find the job and or have the job but hate the job. Whatever that transition looked like for you and yours, when they're in that new world and now all of a sudden you're like, what is going on? I don't understand. So what can a family member do to help their military service member understand and progress through this?
Yeah, Anna, I mean, a lot of things you're talking about, we couldn't know. It's a lot of unknown that happens like during this time. So the short answer up front is that military spouses can help their service members to get help. I can completely relate to this. Military spouses do the best job othering, which means we do a lot for others, the moving, the packing, the rearranging, the enrolling, and all the things. The one thing we can't do for our service member is to manage their emotions. We need to not enable them and not placate their anger or their depression, such as doing things for them. When we do that, we're helping them to stay stuck. We need to speak up and tell them what we're seeing, need to normalize that what they're experiencing is not something that they're going through alone, and we need to help them to get help them to get connected. So I like to use this analogy when I talk about emotions. Our emotions are like a compass. They direct us where we need to go. They tell us about our wants, our needs, and our desires. If we're unable to identify our own emotions, or we don't allow ourselves to feel our emotions, it's like we drive ourselves into a ditch. So connecting to organizations or even going to therapy, we can explain this to our service members, it's like recalibrating or realigning your compass. Therapy can help our service members to learn that they can have both. They can have both show their emotions and be strong, and they can also ask for help and still have control. They tend to have that, it's that seesaw. I can have one, not the other, but they can start to learn that once they learn to gain control, they can have both. Those are both okay.
Okay. So before I dive into what you just said, we had a question come from our audience. So can you share about including a spouse statement with the VA benefits application? Is this something you know about, Anne?
Can you share about? Okay, so I know that the different, I don't work for Veterans Benefit Administration, the VBA, but yes, the spouse can give statements. I know that a lot of times the veterans are asked to provide statements. I think that's recommended because our spouses see more of us than we do. They're like a mirror. Our spouses reflect back what we're doing, and we don't want to see it. So I highly recommend that if you have more insight into what you're seeing your spouse is displaying, then definitely write supportive statements for that.
Got it. So Jessica's comment is about when they're going through the VA process, after they transition, spouses have an opportunity to share what they see or what they've experienced with their service member, to be part of that gathering of documentation, to provide them with a rating in certain areas. That's what Jessica's talking about. So yes, you absolutely can do that. And actually other people other than spouses are allowed to do that as well. I do know service members that are connected to you can also provide statements if there was an experience that was a shared experience, or any other family member or friend that is closely related to you and has spent a lot of time with you. They can all submit statements. So if that's something that you think would help your service member, then absolutely that's something that you can do. So, okay, I want to go back to your comments that, first of all, I love that you called us that we're good at othering. Like, I love that word right now. Like, it made me laugh. Yes, we are, as military spouses are definitely excellent others. We take care of all the things, make sure it gets done. Anyway, that was just such a great way of talking about everything that we do, right? But you're right. We cannot take care of or fix or repair that emotional portion of what your service member is going through. So I love that you are saying, send them to therapy, help them retrain their mind. But this is kind of a question that I have as well for you, but Sarah also threw it up here into the comments. What do you do? And she's specifically talking about statements, but what do you do if your service member is pushing you out and they are refusing to have that conversation with you, whether it be about sending in a statement or if it's about going to therapy or even talking about what they did in deployment 20 years ago? What do you do?
That's a hard one, because sometimes it's the service member has to learn that there's like a consequence to their behaviors. Sometimes I have service members that come for therapy and they're on their third marriage. And they say things to me like, if I had only learned this when I was married to my first wife, I would still be with her. I'd still be with him. So that's a difficult one. There has to be some type of a consequence to make them want to get help. And that's why I'm trying to say, like, one way is through voicing to them, like, that you're not okay with how they're expressing their emotions or the lack thereof, or that you're no longer engaging with people that you want to have around. If we act as if everything's okay, then there's not going to be a change. That's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. And, I'm just what you just said right now, really like just spurred a thought in my mind, right? So when I first started this transition was hard for our family. It happened during COVID. This is my story, right? If you've watched these live streams, you know this story already. You're like part of my group, right? But for anyone new to this broadcast, transition was really difficult for us. during COVID. We just didn't have the same services or support centers. Everything was closed. People weren't at work, So in addition to that, it was this compiling of my spouse's 24 years and then not having, I guess, because we didn't have that normal path forward where people were even hiring at that point. I mean, nobody in COVID was hiring at that point, right? We didn't have that traditional path forward. Things just kind of piled on us. And I was like, there has got to be a better way to do this. There is no way this is the way transition. This is supposed to be the golden years of our military life, right? Where we're supposed to ride off into the sunset, happy and cheerful and loving each other and so excited to be able to do whatever we want. And that was not the case, right? But the big thing was the fact that my service member was not voicing what he was experiencing. And it did start to cause problems within our relationship, our family. And it wasn't until I started speaking up that some things started to change. Now, I know this is not the norm, right? I mean, I was that spouse. So my ability to speak out has helped now my service member feel less stigmatized, I guess, maybe by our personal experience. So I say things out loud, right? I say things out loud like, my veteran has PTSD. I wrote a blog article on it. I talked to him about what I was writing before I put it in there. I said, this is going out to lots and lots of people. It's going to live on the internet, which means it's forever, right? Are you okay with this? And we had to have that conversation. But I also know that that's really hard to do, and not everyone is going to respond the same way. But what it's helped him do at this point is it's helped him say, I have PTSD, and acknowledge that that is something that he's dealing with. And then step 2 for us has been now, what are you doing about that? Right? Because I'm going to tell you guys a little secret, but it's been 2 years and I still fight him to do any kind of therapy. 2 years, he acknowledges that this is an issue and he still doesn't want to do therapy. And I'm like, I'm totally outing him on a live stream right now. But that's okay, because I think he would be all right with this, because this is a conversation we have all the time. I want him to do it. I think it will help. Talk to anybody other than me. Tell them, be mad at them, right? Share your emotions with them. Don't share your emotions. Somebody else is going to be better at pulling it out of you than I am, because I get frustrated. I'm too close to the situation. So what's been your experience in this area, Anne? I mean, I know you're both a veteran and you're a military spouse that's transitioned, right? So, I mean, what's your experience been with this?
So what I would say, I just want to throw in a little bit of extra about the VA, is that we are including families more, that we do have couples therapy, we do have caregiver support programs. So the VA is working hard to incorporate more services to include the family members. In that aspect, you can help the service member to become more aware of what it is that they're experiencing, because a lot of it is out of their awareness. So this shows up for me because my spouse transitioned in September, this past September, after 21 years of service in the Army. And he went from being in the air defense, working with missile systems, to now he's a middle school history teacher. So it's a huge change, working with children and not soldiers, and being surrounded with more women in the teaching profession. And so he's had frustrations and been open about it. One day they were disagreeing about lesson plans, and he just made a comment like, why do we have to talk about it? Just do it. Like, what does it matter? And I told him, I was like, babe, in the military, it's like, you don't worry how you feel, you just do it. But in the civilian world, from my experience, people want to feel good about something or they have to do it. So I'm very grateful for all of the people that work with my husband, because they're helping him through this transition too. He was very vocal about that he was transitioning. They've supported him with that. And as military spouses, we need to just be able to accept that we can't do this on our own. We're fooling ourselves if we think we can. It takes a village to help our service members transition. whether they connect with the VA, the Wounded Warrior Project, or other resources in the community. Our veterans need to get connected. And I can see that that's been a world of help for my husband as well, just to get that sense of purpose and connection in his new role.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's difficult too. I mean, I don't know. I'm going to do a live stream about this a little bit later, but does anybody else have like an issue, their service members struggle making friends, right? Or like good, close friends? Like, I think he'd rather just hang out with me all the time or my friends all the time. Right. And he's a charismatic guy. He's fun to be around. He likes to golf and like got some good hobbies, woodworking and all that. And I'm like, why don't you have like, where's your friends? And so it's been really interesting to me just kind of watching this process of trying to help him find a group that he's comfortable in and have that group become a support system from him. And that's kind of what you're talking about, right? Like your husband becoming a teacher and now being surrounded by people that are supporting him through that process of learning, like, hey, guess what? When we're in high school, we do want to talk about it and feel good about the process. We're not just going to blindly do whatever it is that we're supposed to do. That's not the way it works, right? So I love that. I love that you brought that out as just from your personal experience. We have one last question we're going to take from our audience, and then we're going to have to close up because we're already at 43 minutes, which is awesome because like you will see echoed in the comments on the different places that we're streaming. This is so, I'm going to throw this one up there first. These are things that we need to be having conversations about. And yes, vulnerable transparency. If I'm not doing it, if Anne's not doing it, if other people aren't doing it, nobody's going to do it. So I guess I'm just, like I said, I threw my husband under the bus a little bit today, but he's going to be okay with that because we're going to talk about it afterwards, right?
Good.
So the last question that we have from our audience today, is there a role to be played by extended family members, parents, siblings, relatives, or hometown friends of the service member during transition? What would you say for Gary?
Well, that's my father-in-law.
Okay. I'm so glad you're here. And so he's wondering what he gets to do next, I'm going to say. I love that.
I think he's been very supportive, but I think the best way our extended family members can support is just listen, ask us what we're experiencing, and just ask how can they help? Because it's when they listen and then they also help that is so supportive. I mean, they're coming down and spending time with our children during spring break, and those are things we never had the opportunity to do, being overseas and just moving so much. And so taking the time to spend time with us makes a world of a difference.
Oh, I'm going to say, I'm going to put it, I second that motion in the air, right? It does make a big difference. We lose so much when we move from place to place. We lose so much connection, and having family after transition, even when you're in the military, but especially after transition, having them acknowledge and come and visit and play that role and be close. It is absolutely something. It is one of those wonderful golden path things that you look forward to. So I love that answer. Okay. All right. And unfortunately, we are at the end of our live stream. We've still got comments go back in. We still got people that are saying things, but we'll answer your questions on the flip side. Or let me throw this up here right now and tell people how they can reach out to you directly, connect with you if they have other needs and or for support that you might be able to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely LinkedIn and Instagram, any of those ways on there, I will respond.
Okay. Is there one better way than others, or just any of those, and you just throw it out there and it doesn't matter, whatever your best option is?
I'd say probably LinkedIn is the best one. I just wanted to echo what you said, like this conversation today has ended, but it's definitely not over when this live broadcast ends. It needs to keep going.
Absolutely. And I will tell you, as someone who is in the Spouse Link world, this is my job with the Spouse Link, is to make sure this conversation continues. So if you're out there listening, if you have a hot topic that you are very interested in, please let me know what that is. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from you directly. Okay, so we are at the end of our show. I do want to, I'm going to pull this up really quick. All right, so thank you for being part of today's Spouse Link live stream, and special thanks to you for taking the time today to have this conversation with me, for being so prepared to answer these questions, for sharing your personal experience and your professional experience as well. It is invaluable for military spouses, military families, and for veterans, and for extended family members like Gary, which I was so glad to see him on here today. I can't tell you how important these conversations are. I know they're important because I hear from spouses every day saying, thank you for talking about whatever it is we've talked about. And today has been no exception. You can just see from the comments how many people are invested in making something better for their service members. So there's simply too much going on during transition to focus on this. And so I'm so glad that we have your experience here that's going to help guide members of our audience forward. Now, our next live stream that's coming up, you can see it right here on the screen. It's going to be with Brittany Bocher. You may have heard of her. Brittany runs a program across military bases called Discovering Your Spark. And she's partnered with the ESO and has been offering them virtually as well. So I am all over the place with dates today. March 15th, just in a couple of weeks, Brittany is going to be doing a virtual version for transitioning and retiring spouses, how to discover your spark after retirement and transition, right here on your next Spouse Link live stream. So do me a favor. I want you to sign up for our upcoming Spouse Link conversations that we are having. I'm going to go ahead and drop that information into the comments right now so that you can sign up with your email address. I just threw that in there. You can find it right there. Sign up with your email address to find out about all the other things that are coming up. And remember, we started this series to help military spouses who are nearing retirement, in the middle of transition, or who have already gone through it. I love being part of this Spouse Link mission to support, inform, and inspire. And Anne, thank you for being part of that mission today as well. I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us live today. We look forward to having you at our next Spouse Link live stream, and we'll see you later.
Thanks,
Bye.
Anna.
Yeah.
Bye.